for having me. I'm delighted to be here, to be doing this for Silver Talkies, particularly because I have a special place in my heart for Silver Talkies, because my mother-in-law has been part of it for quite a while now. And I see her completely and thoroughly enjoying herself with all the programs that you guys organize. Of course, the highlight for me and perhaps for her was the fashion show that you had last year, the seniors fashion show, and they got to wear such lovely clothes, which otherwise they normally would not have. Adventurous clothes. My mom-in-law was in an off-shoulder gown and she was rocking it totally. So we all came for the event, and it was lovely to see seniors dancing, singing, walking the ramp. So I love what you guys do. So when you went to us, I was like, it would be my pleasure and my privilege. So very happy to be here and happy to know that so many of you have joined in and signed up for this. So I'll try to make it worth your while. The thing is that, first of all, this is the book that we have been talking about. It's called From Leeches to Slug Glue, 25 Explosive Ideas that Made and Are Making Modern Medicine. World. And now only recently we have come to believe that again. But so prevention as a that it's in your hands, that it's not a divine curse that you fall ill, but it's how you take care of your body. If you treat your body like a temple, if you put the right things into it, if you exercise your muscles, if you're calm, if you breathe deep and long, more than short and shallow, if you don't let your emotions get the better of you, you will live a longer life and a better life, was an idea enshrined in Ayurveda. So in that sense, they were far ahead. Of course, we had our fabulous doctors, the physician Charaka, who knew everything there was to be known about plants and roots and leaves and how to make potions and lotions out of all these, and how to include heavy metals into them, processed in a way to make them safe. So all this knowledge was already there in India 2,500 years ago. There was also Sushruta, as you know, he was a first surgeon. At least the best known that we know of. The Sushruta Samhita is a tome with all his findings and discoveries. And he was, most of you know this, that he was a pioneer in cosmetic surgery. And his two specializations were rhinoplasty, reconstructing the nose, and otoplasty, reconstructing the ears. So this sort of intrigued me. And I was like, why would you want to reconstruct nose and ears? It's not as if in the modern day we go around ramming our noses or ears against something that they need to be reconstructed. So what was it in ancient times, in ancient India, that caused noses and ears to be so damaged so often that they needed to be reconstructed, and it needed a genius surgeon to even figure out a way to do it? And the answer that I came upon, one of the theories, and perhaps this is true, there are some very genuine accounts, historical accounts, that whether it was a war criminal, an enemy, or a regular kind of criminal, to humiliate them and to brand them for life, the ears and the noses would be chopped off, because that was, the extremities were easy to reach with a sword in war and also later. And disfiguring the face as it is today, acid attacks, all that, disfiguring the face is a very terrible thing to do to somebody. It's most humiliating. It brands them for life. They can never walk around in public without everybody knowing that they were up to something. So that was the practice in those days, and therefore it needed somebody to figure out a way to reconstruct nose and ears so that person could have a full and happy life post his crime or his punishment, or the fact that he was on the wrong side in a war. So he figured out rhinoplasty and otoplasty. But the other thing that Sushruta was really, really famous for, and a true pioneer in every sense of the word, was cataract surgery. Now, I'll just show you a picture of the eye too, so that you refresh your memory. I'm sure many of you, since many of you are seniors, you probably know everything about cataract. Younger ones here not know exactly what happens. There is the pupil here in the front the eyeball, which lets in the light. There is a lens in between, which focuses the light rays coming in, which is in front of you. The image, an inverted image of it is formed on the retina, which is the screen at the back of the eye. And from there, the optic nerve takes that information away to your brain, which interprets it and then tells you what you're seeing is a tree, right? So in cataract, what happens when you're older, it's a problem of old age. When your lens gets stiff, hard, and opaque, it begins to get opaque. So when the lens gets opaque, what happens? The light rays that enter are stopped right there. Light cannot pass through and no image is formed on the retina, therefore, which means, in effect, you are blind, right? So this is what happens when you have a cataract problem. And today, how we deal with it is we just take that lens out, the old lens, and then we replace it with a laboratory-made lens. And even if you were highly myopic before that surgery, the moment the lens is replaced, you can see excellent. You have fabulous vision, right? So you get a second chance at vision with cataract surgery today. Of course, in Sushruta's time, there were no labs making artificial lenses. He still had a technique for cataract surgery. What was it? What he used to do was insert a sharp, thin, fine instrument into the eye. And given that, when I ask this to children, like, what do you think he did? Many of them say, did he used to replace it with a goat's eye lens? Or did he used to? No, all that was too risky. So they didn't know how to do those kinds of things in those days. So what he used to do was pretty effective and a smart move. What he did was with a sharp tool, he would push the old lens, the damaged lens, out of its place into this gel, which fills the eye and gives the eyeball its shape. He pushes it into that vitreous humor. This is called vitreous humor, the gel that is inside the eye. And he would push the lens right into this vitreous humor. And so there would be no lens. Now, if there is no lens at all, what happens? The light comes in. It's not stopped by an opaque lens. It goes straight through. It doesn't get focused. So it goes straight through. And some kind of image is formed on the retina and on the screen. So what that does, of course, you can't see clearly. However, it saves you from a terrible fate of complete blindness and complete dependence on other people, because you can still see, you can make out light and dark, night and day. You can make out color. You can see movement. So if somebody's coming towards you, you can see not clearly, but you can see. So it reduces your dependence. So it was a great gift he gave to the ancient world. And this technique was called couching. Okay, it was a particular technique that he developed. So that was Ayurveda, and that was long ago. And then, then medicine went through a phase where, of course, the Greeks were also experts. If there was an ancient world medical Olympics, it would be the Indians, the Chinese, and the Greeks on the podium. In which order, I will not hazard to guess. We can say that Indians would have been on the top, but the Greeks were pretty good too. And we don't know enough about what the Chinese were up to, but they were up to a lot of things. So as it is today, we don't know what they're up to. The same thing continues. So what was I saying? Yeah, so the Greeks were pretty good at it for a long time until the Greeks got taken over by the Roman Empire. Now, when the Roman Empire took over, it grew and grew and grew, that period in 300 AD, around 300 AD. The Roman Empire became so big, and then Emperor Constantine of the Roman Empire, he made Christianity the official religion, and then, then Christianity began to spread, all that happened. And then it became so large and bulky, the Roman Empire, that it was divided into two, to be administered by two separate equal status emperors. And there was a Western Roman Empire, which had Italy as part of it, and an Eastern Roman Empire, which had Greece as part of it. And then the Germanic hordes attacked the Western Roman Empire in about 460 to 490. Collapsed, and all the classical knowledge of the Greeks, which had become part of the Roman Empire, disappeared. Disappeared in the sense that no one on this side of the Roman Empire knew very much how to read Greek. Plus the new dispensation which had come to take charge of the empire, they were not interested in keeping the Greek classical texts alive. So the knowledge of Europe disappeared from Europe. However, the Eastern Roman Empire, continued for another 1,000. And then what happened? And Germanic hordes took over Western Roman Empire and demolished it. Western Europe entered something called the Dark Ages. For 1,000 years after that, hardly any development happened in any field of education. And that was quite recent if you think about it. I mean, until the 1300 AD, there was hardly any development in the Western Europe, which is very difficult to think about now. Can you imagine 1,000 years of no development? But that was Europe. Now we think of Europe as some kind of front runners, which they have been for the last few hundred years. But before that, they were not. It's important to think about history in this way, how power and money and everything changes hands. So different people come into their prime, different civilizations come into their prime at different times, and then they fade and something else happens. So in those 1,000 years, which was the civilization that was making all the progress, all the new inventions and discoveries, whether it was in astronomy or physics or chemistry or medicine, particularly medicine, was the Islamic Empire. Because the Eastern Roman Empire was called Byzantium, and it was headquartered at Constantinople. But then the Islamic Empire became bigger, swallowed all that up. And the Islamic Empire, because it was started, of course, with Muhammad the Prophet. He also began to conquer a little bit. And then his successors, the caliphs, they continued expanding the kingdom until it became so large. It went from Spain and Portugal in the west all the way to Sindh in the east, and took in a lot of Africa in between. So this was the Islamic Empire, and huge amounts of progress in every way. And it was the Islamic Empire, in fact, because Muhammad the Prophet had these teachings, and the Quran was in Arabic. So once he passed away, his successors, the caliphs, they wanted to spread the word of God. And so big, but the kind of neighbors they took over, and it went up, it became so large, and everybody spoke different languages. But how do you then translate the Arabic of the Quran into languages, the word of God into languages that everyone could understand? And thus began a huge project called the Translation Project. And then everything began to be translated into Arabic, and then of course back from Arabic into Greek and into Persian and into Sanskrit. And that's how, for the very first time, under the Caliph Harun al-Rashid, because the Quran had laid a lot of emphasis on education and learning. So scholars were given a very high place in the Islamic Empire, and works from Persian and Sanskrit and Greek were all being translated into Arabic. So for the first time in a library founded by Caliph Harun al-Rashid in the late 8th century, so 700 and something, late 8th century, it was called the House of Wisdom. It was in Baghdad. And for the first time, all the medical knowledge of both East and West were to be found in one place. Of course, all these were handwritten books, right? So it was very precarious, and once they were all translated into Arabic, from Arabic, Sanskrit works got translated into Greek, and then the Greek, and began to travel back into Italy via Naples. And that's how the classical texts of Greece, of Europe, went back to Europe via the Islamic Empire. And then building on that, building on all the knowledge of the Sanskrit, of medical texts, of the Persian medical texts, of the Greeks' own medical texts, that's how Italy went into the Renaissance. It got a huge spur because of all this, and then went on to build on that. And luckily for the Greeks, what happened was the Mongols invaded Baghdad in 1200 and something. And the siege of Baghdad lasted just 2 weeks. The caliph was beheaded, whoever the caliph was at that time, and everything was laid waste in Baghdad. Every single tome in the House of Wisdom in Baghdad were dumped into the river Tigris. And the Islamic Empire never recovered from that body blow. And then it was the turn of Europe to become resurgent and go for its place in the sun, which is continuing to this day, right? So that's how medical knowledge from across the world started in Greece, was isolated in Sanskrit Persian because of language issues. I mean, the Sanskrit, we knew so much, but it never went to other countries because there was no way to translate it until the Islamic Empire did this for us. So this somehow, I find it very, very unfair that this part of history about how much the Islamic Empire and the Indians have gained from each other is somehow not taught in our history books at all. And we are taught to idolize and venerate Europe, America, but we miss out this crucial part of our history, and they are our neighbors. So that is also part of my thing in this book. I know it's a book on medicine, not on history, but particularly medicine reached high levels during the Islamic Empire. That's why I was glad to put that into this book as well. Now, let's come to some more modern stuff. This is all how it went back to Greece. So let's talk now with what we're in the middle of a pandemic. We are trying to find a vaccine for COVID-19. But how was the first vaccine? How did it come about? And who was responsible for it? This was in 1796. We all know that date. Perhaps we don't remember the date, but we remember the name of the man who made the first vaccine, and for what disease he did also, most of us will know. Smallpox. And who was the person who came up with it? Edward Jenner, this Englishman called Edward Jenner in 1796. But once again, there's a history to it that involves Asia. Okay, because smallpox was endemic to many parts of the world, and people had come up with their own, by trial and error, they had figured out ways to prevent it, mitigate it. So how did they do it? What is smallpox? It's a highly disfiguring disease, right? And if you're lucky if you get away with disfiguration. Mostly you die or you become deaf. Terrible things, and your body is full of sores. It was a very, very contagious disease, just like COVID-19 is highly contagious. So you could not be in the presence of someone with smallpox. It was very, very dangerous. But the progression of the disease happened with, first there were sores inside the mouth, then there were sores on the arms and legs, little pustules, and they were all wet and full of pus for a while. And then the scabs would begin to dry up. I mean, the pustules would begin to dry up, scabs would form, scabs would fall. And that period of the disease, scab fall, was the least infectious phase of the disease. So what people, can you imagine? I don't know how human beings figured these things out. So what they figured out was, if you collected all the powder, or you introduce that powder into a healthy person through a small cut in his skin. In the sense, what are you actually doing? You are introducing weak smallpox viruses back into a healthy person. And if you were able to do that, the person's body immune system would figure out a way to battle those. And because they were weak, usually they would end up, defeating them, destroying those germs. But what happens, you do know how the immune system works, right? How when germs go in, if it's a known germ, if our white blood corpuscles which fight infection, if our immune system has this germ already in its rogues gallery of germs, in its library, it knows how to attack and neutralize that germ. But if it's an all new germ, just like COVID-19 is, the immune system has no idea how to neutralize it. So by putting this powder of the scab into a person's body, they introduce the immune system to those germs, but in a weak form. And once the immune system figures out that this is it, next time when a really strong germ comes in, it knows that, I recognize you, you rascal, I'm going to take you down because I know who you are. Right? So equip the immune system with the identification of who this germ is and how to fight it, and give the immune system a handicap because the germ is very weak. Now, so this was called variolation, this process. Of course, nobody knew about that it was a germ, nothing. They just figured out that if they do this, somehow those people get saved and they don't contract the disease, or even if they do, they contract a mild form of the disease and they survive. But even in this, there was a 1 to 2% chance that even if you introduced a very mild form, if you did variolation, that person could contract a severe form of the disease and die. There was always a chance, but 98% of the people got got defense mechanism against the disease. So this kind of practice was going on in Turkey, India, all that for generations, for hundreds of years. Nobody knew why it worked, but they knew it worked. And this was introduced into England by a person called Lady Montagu, whose husband was stationed in Istanbul as an English ambassador. And she saw that this practice was there, it seemed to work, and she had lost her brother to smallpox. She herself had been highly disfigured by smallpox. So she took a risk and said, my children will be variolated in Turkey as they do it here, because I don't want them to get smallpox. So she, in the presence of the embassy doctor, she got her children variolated. And he went back, Charles Maitland went back to the UK saying, oh my God, this actually works. Because after that, that boy was exposed to real smallpox and he didn't contract it. But of course, you know, people in England, some backward country with heathens, you know, how can we take their practices and do it in our country, all that. So it was ignored. Then she came back, her husband finished his posting, they came back. Her daughter, she got her, you know, variolated in the presence of the royal court. She said, see, I'm doing this, I'm taking a risk with my own daughter. It actually works. Everybody in England should be variolated. But once again, they didn't believe her. But this time, Charles Maitland said, no, this has to be done. He was the doctor in the embassy who had come back to the UK. So he said to the royal court, please, I ask for a favor. Ask for volunteers from the convicts on death row. Okay, anybody who wants to volunteer for this trial. Basically, what I will do is I will variolate them and then I will expose them to smallpox. This was human trials in those days. Now, if you try something like that, you're finished. Okay, but I just volunteers. Anyway, they're on death row. Anyway, they're going to be hanged. So if they're willing to take it, if they're willing to come and submit themselves to this trial, to this test, and they don't contract smallpox when it's introduced to them, they will be allowed to walk free. Now, that was a good enough incentive. Lots of people volunteered. He tried it out. They were all into smallpox. None of them contracted the disease. And that's how variolation became common practice in the UK. However, there was always the small chance that people could actually die, even when, I mean, it was so counterintuitive, right? That you protect someone from a deadly disease by introducing the disease into them. I say, how can it even work? And then to compound the problem, 1 or 2% would actually die, even because of the variolation. They would get fever and there's smallpox and die. So it was a bit unsafe, but because of the larger benefits, it was practiced throughout the UK. Until this guy, Edward Jenner, he was very interested in animals, in nature. His zoology findings had got him an invitation to be a member of the Royal Scientific Society, all that. So he was very much with cows. He was on a farm. And he noticed something, you know, all the common thing about all scientists is that they're very observant. They see things that others do not. They make connections that others do not because they are constantly looking and observing. And somehow, sometime it clicks. Like Louis Pasteur said, Louis Pasteur actually was the first guy who made the connection between germs and disease, right? He said, when he figured it out, he said, chance in French, chance favors a prepared mind. There is no such thing as luck or fortune. If your mind is prepared, if you're constantly in that process of connecting, then one day that Eureka connection will happen. So what Edward Jenner saw was that milkmaids, there was another disease called cowpox, which cows used to get, and they used to get these pustules on their udders. Now, milkmaids who milked those cows would get the same disease, cowpox. They would get pustules on the palms of their hands. But after a few days, like of rest, they would come back to work and they would be absolutely fine. Edward Jenner noticed something that he had. The milkmaids who had contracted cowpox once never seemed to get smallpox, even when the disease was raging in the neighborhood. It's like smallpox is so infectious, but somehow these guys have some divine armor against smallpox. How is that possible? And he thought to himself that maybe, let me try this. Let me, you know, this was also an age when there were no, you know, scientists were allowed to do what they like. There was no body governing, no, you can't do this. There were no trolls on the internet. There were no protests in the street saying you can't do all this. Scientists basically did whatever they wanted. So here was Edward Jenner, and he was a doctor. And he thought to himself, what if I introduce cowpox into a healthy person and then expose him to smallpox? And if he doesn't get smallpox, that means the cowpox provides enough immunity, in the sense the antibodies that the body develops to fight cowpox are also effective against smallpox. So he said, okay. So of course, who will he try it on? There was a milkmaid called Sarah, someone, her name is in my book. And he took an 8-year-old, 9-year-old child, a boy. He took the pus from the pustules of the cowpox ladies of this woman, and he made a little cut in that boy's skin, introduced the pus into his body. He got a mild fever, he got cowpox, then he recovered. And then a few weeks later, he exposed him to smallpox, like severe smallpox. And the boy remained absolutely healthy. And that was when Jenner said, this works and it's much safer, because cowpox is absolutely safe. You can infect people with cowpox as much as, and let me do this. So he called it, his treatment, he called it variole vaccine. And vacca in Latin is cow. So he said the variolation from a cow, variole vaccine. And that's how the word vaccine entered our vocabulary. Vaccine has nothing to do with medicine. It means cow. It has something to do with cow, right? So, and the cow, milkmaid got it. That cow was named Blossom, just a little bit of trivia. And that Blossom's hide, after she died, she was skinned, and Blossom's hide still hangs in a museum in Edward Jenner's hometown. You know, as this is the cow that paved the way for vaccination. And that is how vaccination came to be, and smallpox now has been eradicated. The after story, the rather scary after story to all this, is that now in the 21st century in America, there is a huge lobby of people who call themselves the anti-vaxxers, V-A-X-X-E-R-S, not W-A, anti-vaxxers, who believe that vaccinating their children makes them autistic. Okay, so they do not vaccinate their children. I mean, this is like, it's a cult. They do not vaccinate their children, which is all very well for their children, right? But what happens when a set of people is not vaccinated is that the germ comes back. So the germ, smallpox germ, never went anywhere. It was just controlled, right? Through vaccination, through vaccinating every member of the population. But now, because they're not vaccinating, the germ is back. And suppose you have to vaccinate at the age of 2. What happens to the unprotected babies in that community if the kids who didn't get a vaccination get the disease? They will easily pass it on to these babies. So what is lost for the entire community is a phrase that we have been hearing a lot of in the last 2 months. What is lost in a community when some people are not vaccinated is, what is lost is herd immunity. Herd immunity is something that a population develops when enough of the population is vaccinated, because the virus or the germ then is not able to find a toehold in that entire population. Okay. So I think I'll tell you the story, another connected very closely to our current situation of washing and washing and washing and washing hands, right? We are going on washing our hands, and you know, the people are like having dry skin because of washing. But imagine a time, this was 1847, when nobody knew that germs cause disease. So then why would you wash your hands, right? So washing hands was not considered important at all. People only washed hands to take dirt off or to take smell off, not just as a matter of course we'll wash our hands, never. So I'll tell you the story of something that happened in Austria in a place called the Vienna General Hospital. So the Vienna General Hospital had 2 clinics, maternity clinics, called the first clinic and the second clinic. And the person in charge of both the clinics was somebody called Dr. Ignaz Semmelweis. He was a Hungarian doctor, and his name was Ignaz Semmelweis. And what were the first and second clinics? Why had they been set up? The thing was, what they offered to the population of Vienna was that anybody with an unwanted pregnancy, teenage pregnancies, prostitutes of the streets who got pregnant and didn't want to keep their babies were invited to the hospital for a free delivery. They said, we will deliver your baby for free, and then we will keep your baby as well. You can leave the baby and go away, right? And you'll be free to walk the streets again. So obviously this was a very tempting proposition, but why would the clinic offer it? So that the obstetricians and gynecologists there would get practice in delivering babies, and then they could hone their skills, especially students. So it was a teaching hospital. And this was offered to all the people on the streets of Vienna. The difference between the first and the second managed, everybody there was a doctor, means he mostly had spent a lot of years perfecting and was considered very, very high up. And the second clinic was run by midwives. Okay, so, and at this time in Europe, the maternal mortality rate, or the number of people who died in childbirth or soon after childbirth, was the average across Europe was 10%. The maternal mortality rate was 10%. That means out of every 100 women who gave birth in a hospital, 10 would die for sure. So having a baby was a death sentence, almost life-threatening experience, right? And so this was accepted. Nobody knew why it was there, but it was there. It was just accepted as a side effect, because what would happen is they would give birth to the baby, and within a few days, 10% of them would develop something called puerperal fever and usually succumb to it. Nobody knew how to treat it. It was happening all the time. But what Ignaz Semmelweis, the doctor in charge of first and second clinics, what puzzled him and what sent him into a tizzy was that the first clinic where the doctors operated and practiced had a higher MMR, maternal mortality rate, than the second clinic where the uneducated midwives practiced their profession. And this irked him no end. So he went and observed both, and he said, you know, whatever the midwives do, we should do the same thing. But he found they were doing exactly the same thing as the doctors, because he had trained the midwives himself. And he just could not understand why more people were dying here. In fact, when people were picked up off the streets and told that you are now admitted you're going to be admitted in the first clinic, those women would fall to their knees and say, please, no, I want to go to the second clinic. And if that was not possible, they would say, then I'll give birth to my baby on the street. And even street births had a lower maternal mortality rate than what was happening in the first clinic. And this really troubled Ignaz Semmelweis. And he just couldn't figure it out until one day, one of his colleagues, a man, died with symptoms very similar to puerperal fever. And he said, how did this happen? This was supposed to be a disease of women, and that too women who had given birth. So how did this man, my colleague, a doctor, get puerperal fever? So when on further investigation, he figured that a wound in his arm had got infected, and that was the sepsis. That's what had caused the puerperal fever and everything else. How did he get the wound in the arm? While he was dissecting, he was doing an autopsy on a woman who had died of puerperal fever in the mortuary. He was demonstrating it to his students. One of his students' scalpels had poked him in the arm by mistake. And that's when Ignaz Semmelweis said, so there is something in that person's body who is dead of fever, which was transferred to my colleague's body, things, whatever came from there to here. He called them cadaverous particles because he didn't know what it was. But clearly there was something that had been transferred from the body to this person. That's why he had got the fever. And that's when the penny dropped. He said the only difference between the doctors in the first clinic and the midwives in the second clinic is that the doctors also work at the mortuary and the midwives go nowhere near the mortuary. So he said, but that's all very well, but how do I now bring down this thing? He had no idea. He said, what if I suggest this revolutionary idea that doctors, while they come from the mortuary to the labor room, they should wash their hands. Because all doctors only used to wash their hands on their way home to take out the stink. Surgeons used to joke about good old hospital stink. They would come off the apron from hanging on the hook, which was blood-stained and pus-stained, wear it, and begin doing their surgery without ever washing their hands. Even they came in from the street. And usually there would be an audience watching because that was allowed. So please come and sit, bring all your germs from the street, sit in this room. and watch me do the operation. And the surgeon was a solo rock star. There was no anesthetist. There was no anesthesia at that time. No nurse. Florence Nightingale hadn't had. It was be a solo show. And that is why, to this day, the room where a surgeon operates is called an operation theater, because it was a theater in the old days. So it was that was the kind of, and when he told the surgeons that you have to wash your hands, they were like horrified. They're like, what? We have noble hands. We have clean hands. We have upper class hands. Surely our hands are not dirty. How can our hands be transmitting the disease? Just like we all fussed so much in the beginning when they said you have to wash hands, you have to wear a mask. Oh my God, so painful. So the same thing, those doctors were like, what nonsense. How is that going to happen? I'm a 3-ply mask, 4-ply mask. Same thing, they also protested. But because Ignaz Semmelweis was in charge, he absolutely insisted, as an experiment, he wanted to try it. And particularly because that April 1847, the MMR in the first clinic, or maybe in both the clinics put together, had reached 18.4%. It was much higher than the average of. So he said, you have to wash your hands in carbolic acid. That's what they should use to remove the stink. So they said, oh, all right. And they began to wash their hands and come in. In May, from 18.4%, the mortality MMR dropped to 2.2%. In June, 1.9%. In July, 1.2%. And in August, for the first time, the MMR in the Vienna General Hospital dropped to 0%. And since then, and not even since then, unfortunately, it was a small hospital in Vienna. We never got the word out. It would be another 30, 40 years before people realized that it was germs after Louis Pasteur, and then began washing their hands. So this is the history of washing our hands. So I think I'll stop here. I hope you enjoyed the session, and I'm open to questions now. Not that I have the answers to everything, but I'll try my best.
It's amazing, and we'll ask you lots of questions. It's just amazing to hear about hand washing once again. It really reinforces everyone's, it really reinforces all our hand washing beliefs. So one of the things that everyone wants to ask you is, how did you do your research? It's just fascinating. How much time did you spend on it?
A few months, I think. Thanks to the World Wide Web. My God, we can plug into the common intelligence of all mankind, common wisdom of all mankind at the touch of a button on your smartphone. And all you have to have is the commitment to read. That's all. And research. And it's fantastic. I mean, there's so many, many, many more fascinating stories. And I could only talk about a few.
So what were your research? Of course, the web, but did you also, I mean, the stories you're telling us are fascinating. So did you
I read a lot of fiction as well, historical fiction.
Wow.
I read a lot of historical fiction about medicine. There are authors like Henry Denker and all who've written books set in 18th century Europe, 19th century Europe. And this went from one fascinating fact to the other. It was absolutely mind-blowing. So a lot of research on the internet, a lot of research with books, and then all this kind of lateral research with historical fiction, medical fiction. So lovely time. It took me about 4 or 5 months, and I had already committed that I would do 25 exploratory ideas. So to figure out which 25, it look odd. It would be out of the way.
Yes,
you won't see it. So,
So, during your research, did you feel that when we were listening to you, it came in, the more things change, the more they remain the same. This whole Leeches thing.
Oh,
so many things.
It's funny. I try to write about very different topics, and I think I'm exploring different areas, and it all comes back to the same thing. What it says in the Gita, and the Advaita part of it, it's all a circle, the unity of everything. We just keep going. We think we are making progress, but quite often we're just going around in circles. And every time we make a fresh circle, we perhaps progress a little. So, yeah, it's very interesting.
That's very true.
It's just lovely to see.
Is there any other instance that, hit you like that this is so, this is something that happens now, and this was something that also happened centuries ago? Is there any other instance?
Yeah. Sure. Plasma therapy. You know, we think of it as, which they're trying out now for COVID sufferers. It's not new at all. I mean, it was first tried successfully with diphtheria.
Okay.
Over 100 years ago. And yeah, I think early 900s or late 1800s.
Okay.
Diphtheria was a terrible disease because it wanted to change that. And they found out that some people somehow seemed to be protected against diphtheria and some others succumbed. And then they thought that maybe the sperm is weak, the body is able to produce some antitoxin for it. Okay, because they discovered that diphtheria was caused not by the bacteria itself, but a kind of poison it released. So there was a toxin. And so some children or some humans were able to generate an antitoxin that could neutralize. Right? So they began to explore and they found that it was true. So they said, if we start giving antitoxins to people who have the disease or healthy people, would that serve as a vaccine? And where to get antitoxins? So they by now trials had become a little more regulated. So they started with guinea pigs. They gave guinea pigs very weak diphtheria germs and found that. And then when they extracted their blood, coagulated it and took out just the serum or the plasma, the clear part of blood, they found that antitoxins were in there. And when they injected it into healthy guinea pigs, they did not contract diphtheria. So they said, okay, this might work, but how to produce enough? It was called anti-serum, or the antitoxin laden serum was called anti-serum. How to produce enough anti-serum to give this to so many people in the world? So they said, guinea pigs produce too little, we'll try with larger animals. And it went on larger animals, until horses could produce liters of anti-serum when they were infected with diphtheria germs. So Hext, the pharma company, they paid for the maintenance of hundreds of diphtheria horses, anti-serum horses, which would only provide anti-serum, and that would be converted into a vaccine or a treatment for diphtheria sufferers and healthy people. So that's how diphtheria was conquered. And now they're trying the same thing with COVID. Not been effective in some cases, trying it.
Absolutely. This is just fascinating. Medical history, through these fun facts, because we are regular people, we are not doctors. So how important is it, especially for children, to know this?
Yeah, I think it's really important only because I feel a sense of curiosity is what makes us human, like huge curiosity, and curiosity is the spur to all human development. So if you're just curious about the world and keep on reading and finding out stuff, you will never be bored. And there is no subject that is uninteresting or boring if you have the capacity and facility of curiosity and approach any subject as an interesting, wonderful resource of information. So I think it's important, when, like I was saying, when I wrote this book, it came out in September, because nobody did, that in 4 months, this pandemic would hit the world.
Yeah.
And once again, doctors and healthcare workers would be elevated to the status they truly deserve. Right? But it happened. So I think, especially in this time, it's really interesting. I'll tell you why I think it's really important for people, for children and adults to read medical history, particularly in this time, just to feel hopeful and positive that there have been other times like this in the past. Terrible diseases have come and gone. Plagues have taken away thousands of people. Pandemics have always been around. And every time, human ingenuity, innovation, and expertise has prevailed. We have overcome, and therefore we shall overcome this as well. So just to give you a sense of hope and positivity, which is really important in these times, I think it's important to read history.